Hello. So wonderful to see so many people here on this Zoom call. Welcome to History Homecoming. It's great to have you here and have you back in the History Department's virtual environs. I'm Cathryn Carson. I'm the chair of the Department of History. I am a historian of science and technology who is stepping into the shoes of Peter Zinnemann, our previous chair, who, if you remember, was looking forward a year ago and is now taking a well-deserved sabbatical. I'm welcoming you today on behalf of everyone in the department. And though we're on Zoom right now, and we're delighted at the range of you that the Zoom allows us to reach out to, we have so much bubbling up and going on in the halls of Dwynell that before we started, I wanted to just give you a taste of the energy and excitement that's happening in person. Since our last History Homecoming, as you probably know, we've moved back into in-person teaching. So those halls of Dwynell are increasingly lively. We are expecting a new faculty member, Hidetaka Hirota, to join us imminently. Hide is a historian of US and global immigration, migration, labor. We have really earnest hopes to be adding new faculty, more of them, in Native American history and Russian Soviet history. So adding that kind of breadth and depth to our already rich curriculum for students. We've been experimenting with new courses, and we will be having an in-person commencement ceremony for our graduates in May, for our graduates of this year and the graduates of the previous years who were sadly robbed of that experience. It will be a very, very special and for many of us, very moving event. We all hope that we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel for, I'll just say, this phase of the pandemic. Historians are always cautious about predicting the future, but like all of you, we hope. And so it's thrilling for us now to have a chance to sit around a seminar table with the students and explore with them all the wonderful byways of history, or lead our senior history majors through their 101 theses, as a whole crew of them are doing right now. So the History Department is this community of scholars and teachers and students who are really glad to welcome you back to History Homecoming. We know that you look out for us and we appreciate that. And if you like, you can visit history.berkeley.edu giving to make a donation to our History Annual Fund. And also just look out for the Big Give, which is UC Berkeley's annual campus-wide fundraiser on March 10th. So please save the date, you'll hear from us soon. So turning to our topic this evening, dining out. As you know, just like we do, food is a touchstone for so many of us. It sits at that intersection of just our sheer bodily existence and our lives as people moving through societies and economies and cultures. Food and dining together and dining out are core to how we socialize with each other. Food can be central to defining our identity, who we are, who's encompassed in that we, and how we change over time. And dining out specifically, when we reflect on it, happens at that really interesting nexus of systems of agriculture and food production, transportation, migration, all of the things that come together in economies and power. So food and foodways and dining have been drawing attention in recent years in the history department among both students and faculty. So along with some exciting courses in this area, including those taught by faculty who are with us on this event, we have graduate students doing doctoral dissertations on topics that run the gamut from the sciences of nutrition to environmental history to the circulation of foodstuffs. And I also want to point out work that's done in the history department on the cultural and religious dimensions of food and dining together, including our amazing colleague John Efron's current research project on Jews, Germans, and the meaning of meat from the Middle Ages to today. So it's a really rich topic. And before I pass the baton to our panelists, I want to give first a brief shout out to the team who've made this gathering possible. Maya Cisneros is the front face of our staff team for events. We are so grateful to her for her fluency with these Zoom webinars and just awed by her fabulous preparation. Two of my colleagues, Dilyana Angelova and Sandra Ader, have drawn up tonight's program. I thank them as well. And so, to introduce tonight's speaker in the order in which we get to hear from them, you may well know them, but allow me to give a quick intro to who they are and what they do. First, we'll hear from James Vernon, who's the Helen Fawcett Distinguished Professor of Modern British History, who tackles that subject across its intersecting dimensions, culture, politics, governance, and at pretty much all of its scales, local, national, imperial, global. Professor Vernon is the author some years back of the book Hunger, A Modern History, which I'll highlight tonight among all of his works on modernity in Britain. And in closing, I'll just mention that he's at work on a book about Heathrow Airport, that crossing point of the world. Next, we'll hear from Wen-hsin Yeh, who is a distinguished professor who holds the Morrison Chair as our senior historian of modern China. As a scholar of institutions, culture, and politics, Professor Yeh has published widely on urban societies, intellectuals, knowledge making, print culture, and all of the transformations at work in China from the 19th century to the present. All of this wide-ranging scholarship, as well as her own personal experience, feeds into and informs what she'll talk about with us today. And third, we have Rebecca McLennan, who is a historian of North America in its global context and the holder of the Preston Hotchkiss Chair in American History. Over her career, her interests have also ranged incredibly widely, from incarceration and systems of law to environmental history and global histories of foodways, about which she has taught. Together with our colleague David Henkin, she's the author of an absolutely summative textbook on US history that stands as a landmark for our department. So we have a set of synthetic thinkers with us tonight. So with that, let me just briefly remind you, as we turn it over to our panelists, you are welcome to ask questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. You can add them as you think of them. You can hold them to the end when we'll have time for all of our panelists to respond to questions at once. So, James Vernon, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Like Catherine, I can't wait to meet everyone in person again. I'm truly ashamed to say that after 22 years of being in the department, I've never once attended homecoming. And that's something I'm going to put right next time we meet in person, and I'm happy to put right today. I'm certainly not the sort of person who only comes because I've got invited to talk. Keeping up with alums is actually one of the favorite parts of my job, especially when they're not asking me to write letters for them. So I'm thrilled to be here. But it is a little ironic that of all years, I get asked to talk this year and on this subject. For a long time, as many of you know, eating out in my homeland of Britain was a notoriously awful experience. And on top of that, my only connection really to this subject is writing a book about people not having enough money to eat any type of food, let alone going for a meal out. I'm pleased to be able to say that although one of our current graduate students, Calvin Paulson, was encouraging me to talk to you this evening about food in airports and airplanes, and that would be even grimmer, I think, than talking to you about hunger and the absence of food. So I'm not going to do that. And after teaching on Zoom for a couple of years, I'm afraid this is all I've got. I have complete PowerPoint burnout. So you're just going to have to look at my very large head for the next 10 or 15 minutes. Remarkably, in Britain today, there are almost 90,000 restaurants and mobile food providers. Brits spend almost £60 billion a year in them. And that's an average of about £20 a week, which, well, given where the pound is now, is actually about $25, but it's normally closer to about 30. Since the pandemic began in March 2020, they've been considered such an important part of the economy that they've received £522 million in government support. Support, I should emphasize, that mostly went to the large restaurant chains and breweries that support the current government's party, but that's another issue. The scale of the restaurant sector in the UK today is completely remarkable to me, precisely because it's of really recent vintage, mostly taking off at the very end of the last century, just before I left the country. So to help me make that point, I'm going to very briefly give you a very quick whirlwind history of the different experiences Britain's had eating out from the late 18th century to the present. And I'm going to begin by talking about the origins of the restaurant in the sort of dining clubs and banquets held by social clubs in late 18th century London. Dining clubs were the preserve of the rich, mainly, who ate until they burst, a little like Mr. Creosote in the Monty Python film, The Meaning of Life, if you've seen that. And if you haven't, it's definitely a movie worth watching. So after looking at the dining clubs of the rich, I'm going to turn to those who hadn't to experience having no choice at all, but to eat out in soup kitchens or houses for the poor. Then I'm going to talk about the experience of the working poor, those with regular, if barely sufficient wages. And for them, we're going to see that dining out was more of a question of grabbing a takeout. And fish and chips became the classic example of that. So I'll talk briefly about fish and chips and the place of that in British social life. And then I'm going to end up talking about the proliferation of different ethnic or national cuisines in late 20th century Britain, which was really the beginning of the explosion of the restaurant trade that now has 90,000 establishments across the country. So I know that's an awful lot to do in the amount of time I have, but bear with me, I'll be as economical as I can be. And I'm going to begin with going back to late 18th century London and those fancy dining clubs. Our colleague Rebecca Spann at Indiana University has made a very persuasive case, I think, that the French invented the modern restaurant in the 1760s. And that's partly why so many of our menus still use French words today. But I would say that Brits really didn't need restaurants, because in the 18th century, they could barely fart without creating a new club or society for people to come together and engage in some shared activity or another. We've had two PhD students in the department, India Mandelkern and Brendan Mackey, who've done more than anyone to recover the sort of associational world of these late 18th century clubs and the place of food within them. Clubs and societies were largely organized around drinking and eating. And I'm talking about industrial quantities of food and liquor. So it's hard to imagine how anyone actually endured these dinners. They could have up to 25 dishes. They almost invariably began with soups, and then they moved on to various roast meats, from venison to beef. Fish and turtle even would be used as well. And then there were vegetables, chiefly potato. This is 18th century Britain, and lots of copious sauces and jellies and pickles that my countrymen still adore. And then came the parade of desserts: fruit pies, jellies, cakes, nuts, and lots of custard and cream. And let me just emphasize, this was not a menu. You ate all of it, and it was washed down with plenty of toasting in combinations of beer, wine, port, and brandy. So just imagine for a second the intensity of the hangovers of people enduring this type of feast at an 18th century club. Tellingly, I think when restaurants began opening in London during the early 19th century, they often resembled these dining clubs in their look and in their organization, except for slowly they had to teach their customers how to choose between courses and dishes on a menu, rather than eating everything that was potentially provided. Critically, I think they also reproduced a division of labor in which poorly paid women and very often children served wealthy and slightly grotesquely wealthy men. Dining out was definitely an all-male activity at that time. Now, obviously, the obverse of this world of genteel, if gross dining was the soup kitchen, when no one got to choose what they ate at all. Increasingly in the 19th century, those who received poor relief were institutionalized in workhouses, where they were literally made to work for almost always inadequate quantities of indigestible food, often stews and soups, literally gruel made with the smallest amounts of the very cheapest meats that were available and served with lashings of bread. You'll be familiar, I imagine, with the famous scene in Dickinson's Oliver Twist, when Oliver bravely but foolishly requests more food. You're probably less familiar with the infamous scandal in the 1840s, when it was discovered in the Andover workhouses, people were so hungry that they were eating the putrid flesh of the bones they were supposed to be grinding for fertilizer. So these were clearly not experiences of eating out that anyone desired. And this experience of eating foods within institutions, of course, also stretched increasingly to hospitals, to prisons, to asylums, and eventually to schools as well. And I once ago wrote an article about school meals, which is another horror story that I'm going to save you today. So if eating at restaurants and gorging at feasts was a sort of mark of distinction and wealth, eating away for these populations was basically a sign of failure, of being ignorant, of being sick, of being criminal, or being insane. And in that sense, eating out was literally a way of being punished for being unable to support and feed yourself. I want to turn next then to the most popular way in which people ate out by the late 19th and early 20th century, which I guess is what we would now call the takeout. The respectable poor may have earned enough to keep them out of the workhouse, but they rarely possessed facilities to cook and eat on. At best, they might have a fireplace, some pans and plates, rarely any utensils, and still often rarely a table to sit around. In these conditions, I think, especially in the days immediately after a Saturday when people got paid, the working poor liked to get takeout. Now, there were lots of regionally specific foods that people went to buy as takeout. Pastas in Cornwall, meat pies and gravy in Manchester, eel pies in the East End of London. But really, by the late 19th century, fish and chips have become ubiquitous around Britain. All of these foods were bought in small shops or on food carts, and all were wrapped up in newspaper and eaten with your fingers. And they were really cheap. So in 1900, you could get a quarter pound of fried fish and a whole pound of chips, what you would call French fries, for a single penny, which is about 70 or 80 cents today. So take the cotton town of Preston in the northwest of England, home of the first professional football team in the world, incidentally, which was also about the size of Berkeley today. It had 93 fish and chip shops by 1895 and a remarkable 175 by 1930. That's one fish and chip store for every 700 inhabitants. And fish and chip stalls were a family enterprise. That's to say, men fried the fish, which was the glory job, and women and children did all the other labor for no or little pay. Customers who were short could just buy their chips or stand in line and gossip with neighborhood friends about what's going on. It was definitely, the line at the fish and chip store was definitely a place of sociability and a place for the display of one's respectability that you could afford to buy takeout. By the 1970s, when I was a kid, fish and chips had lost its exclusively working class association, and many middle class families like mine, especially on the coast where I lived, happily picked up the habit. Indeed, I think it was pretty much the only experience I had of eating out as a child, apart from a very rare outing to a generic Italian restaurant somewhere in the East End of London. I recall going, I think, to twice on the way back from visiting my grandparents. Finally, you'll be glad to know, I'm coming to the end of my talk and to the proliferation of these different ethnic and national cuisines like Italian restaurants in Britain that began to displace dishes like roast beef and fish and chips as the national dish of the country. Long before the decolonization of the British Empire, migrants from around the world had made eating out in Britain more cosmopolitan. You could get bagels and what was described as Chinese food in the East End of London by 1900. Italian and French restaurants were pretty common in parts of London like Soho by the 1920s. Winston Churchill, a fan of nothing that was remotely cosmopolitan, tried and happily failed to popularize the idea of a distinctly British restaurant in the Second World War. The idea was to provide workers with a cheap canteen-style food outside of their rations. But the food was not just cheap, it was classically revolting. And those restaurants happily didn't survive the end of food rationing in the early 1950s. So it was only in the 1960s and the 1970s when state-managed welfare capitalism finally delivered Britons a decent standard of living, that eating out in restaurants opened up to the urban middle classes. And this was a time when decolonization had also brought migrants from around the former empire to Britain. And they began to establish restaurants, both to bring together their fellow diasporic populations and to sell to those wanting to experiment with generically labeled foods like Indian, Middle Eastern food, or West Indian foods. To cover their bets, most of these restaurants sold everything with chips. But even that didn't prevent them from having to endure intolerable forms of racism, not just from the far-right groups that were endemic in the 1970s that targeted the premises of these restaurants, but also from their customers, even before the late-night crowds emptied out of the pubs and clubs. So it won't have gone unnoticed, I hope, that I've been suggesting that the experience of dining out in Britain was shaped by capitalism and imperialism, both in terms of who and how people ate out, as well as the division of labor in the provision of foods. But while I like to blame everything on capitalism and imperialism, it's important to remember that eating out can't simply be reduced to or explained by them. As we've learned in the pandemic, I think, for this is the thing that most of us have sorely missed, eating out has always been about sociability. It's always been about meeting friends, celebrating with family, or even just being seen and seeing other people. These are the pleasures to eating out that have different explanations than the logics of exploitation afforded by capitalism and imperialism. But I'm afraid we can never quite forget those logics or get far from them. And the pandemic also served to remind us that those serving us our food were part of the essential workers who are among the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. And for most of us, eating out means that our meals have almost always come at the cost of their inadequate wages and with a threat to their health. So now you know why I'm a famously miserable bastard and have never been asked to speak at homecoming before. And that's something that I now confidently expect to be the case for the rest of my time in the department. And with that, I'll hand over to my brilliant colleague, Wen-hsin Yeh.
Wen-hsin, you are on mute.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. So to follow up on James, let me just start by stating the obvious. Namely, food is not just about eating. Neither is eating just about food. China used to be portrayed as a land of hunger. Nowadays, it's portrayed as an emerging nation of obesity. China's 20th century was about how the communists mobilized a peasant army, rallying demands that everyone should get enough to eat. China's 20th century was also about how cadres and people ate in separate kitchens. The smaller the kitchen, the more abundant the food. When communist forces took Shanghai in 1849, the rich and the powerful fled, heading out to places such as Taipei, Hong Kong, San Francisco, and New York, and taking along with them many of the city's master chefs. Soon after, the communists took over Shanghai, whose restaurants in the Republican period had commanded such a reputation for lavishness and sophistication. As the hardy soldiers of the People's Liberation Army took up sentry positions on the major boulevards, they peppered their political officers with food-related questions. As new peasant liberators, could they allow themselves a taste of the city? Or should they see tempting foods as sources of corruption? Should they celebrate the chefs as hardworking artisans of the art of food that belong to the masses? Or should they denounce the chefs as running dogs of imperialists and comprador bureaucrats and enemies of the people? Now, my remarks this evening, thanks to dire warnings of the organizers, will have none of these big, boring subjects that will serve to wonderfully remind you of the hardship that you had to endure as students in Berkeley classrooms, especially mine. So my talk will be simply about one of my many trips eating out in China, about the memorable dishes that differentiated the two ends of a single journey. My trip took place in 1988. It began in Shanghai, continued on to Hangzhou, and then up the Qiantang Valley to the mountainous counties of southern Zhejiang. China at this time was buzzing in the excitement of economic collectivization. All across the country, regions and locales were rediscovering the uniqueness of their material resources and historical pasts. Regional culture means local cuisine. Eating out was coming into fashion at restaurants of old-time fame, serving dishes represented as local specialties. This reimagination of the past functioned as a resource for present-day consumption. It took place when regional economy was undergoing transformation. It was impossible traveling in China in the late 1980s to avoid coming upon headline news every day about how such and such a county had paved a new motorway, or a province had built a new fleet of trucks with refrigeration, therefore delivering farm fresh eggs and vegetables across a long distance. Over time, the results have been astounding. China ranks today as one of the world's major exporters of chicken eggs and the source of nearly every single chicken eggs sold in Hong Kong, Macau, and Singapore. China is raising billions of chickens and ducks and hundreds of millions of pigs. Zhejiang is the source of a disproportionately large number of these pigs and chickens. The province also has a rich culinary tradition. Ham products of Jinhua in central Zhejiang, for example, were among a small number of national goods that commanded shelf spaces in Shanghai's fancy Western-style department stores in the 1930s. When Edgar Snow, the American journalist, prepared for his trip that would result in the writing of his book, Red Star Over China, he procured no fewer than 8 whole legs of Jinhua ham as gifts for Chairman Mao and his comrades, who had, at this time, retreated to the mountain base area in northern Shanxi. Mao gave up eating pork and chicken in the Great Famine of the 1960s. But by the late 1980s, these items had become ubiquitous in everyday cooking in southern provinces. Pork and chicken had been demoted, indeed, to become staple ingredients for stock and filling that supply flavor and texture in the preparation of exotic signature dishes, such as crabs and snakes. Now, few among the edible things could compete in terms of cultural capital with the freshwater crabs from Lake Yangcheng in Suzhou, home of a fishing culture of interlinked waterways of the Lake Tai ecological system. The region had seen, since the 16th century, spectacular mercantile wealth, thanks to dealings in silk, rice, silver, and money. Such wealth sustained empires and galvanized poetry. Yangcheng hairy crabs, half the size of Dungeness crabs, featured prominently in the verses of generations of wine-sipping poets, sold by the ounce and harvested from a mere 120 acres of lake space. Fresh crabs were steamed and served with vinegar and wine. They were savored in private settings, either in leisure boats or gardens of blooming chrysanthemum, often under the brilliance of the autumn moon, and presented on tables laden with autumn nuts and fruits. The all-crab luncheon that I attended while in Shanghai, however, featured neither poetry nor moonlight. It took place on the second floor of a busy restaurant. It presented multiple courses, including virtually all the crab classics that you can think of. Crab roll dumplings, cracked whole crabs, minced crab meat soup, crab roll tofu, and chicken noodles topped with crab roll and meat. This pricey, high-fat, and high-calorie meal for 6 people must have used at least 2 dozen crabs, plus a certain amount of pork and chicken, all treated to the point beyond recognition. Served with plenty of flavored vinegar, the dishes were certainly intended to facilitate easy consumption within a short period of time. Most impressively, the kitchen was supported by an assembly line of young women working endlessly on the processing of mountains of crabs. Capped, masked, and uniformed, these women worked silently, separating tiny pieces of crab meat from crab legs and collecting, with the help of tiny spoons, every drop of crab roe under the opened shells. Let me hasten to add that somebody else, not the university, paid for that lunch, which kept me satiated for at least a whole week. In Zhejiang, the Thunder Peak Pagoda on the west lake of Hangzhou was the site, in folk legend, of a forbidden love between a young herbalist and the magical white serpent who took female form so as to be his wife. For our purpose, snakes have long appeared in Zhejiang local texts as a source of medicinal remedies. They were captured and killed for their gallbladder, the bile of which, when mixed with herbs and liquor, claimed to cure rheumatism, sharpen eyesight, and boost male virility. Snakes rarely appeared as a dining choice in Zhejiang until things changed in the 1960s, when the southern counties adopted recipes and techniques imported from the neighboring province of Guangdong. How Cantonese cuisine came to incorporate a whole range of wild animals is a subject beyond the scope of my very limited eating experience in China. Limited as that experience was, I was nonetheless exposed on several occasions to the tastes of Zhejiang snakes. Edible snakes ranged from the venomous to the harmless in all sizes, from the colorful to the bland, from the blunt-headed to the pointy-faced. A top-of-the-line recipe attributed to a master chef in Republican Canton was a stew that required the simultaneous use of a king cobra, a bandage crate, and a rat snake. All three, skinned, boned, and diced, would then be tossed into a pot of boiling chicken to be slow cooked with an abundance of julienne chicken, duck, lean pork, fungus, wood ear, and seasoning. To serve snakes as a main course, pair it with deep fried bullfrogs complemented with colorful side dishes such as chili peppers, big leaf greens, and bamboo shoots. It goes without saying that a long autumn evening in the mountains required plentiful of hard liquor. My hosts were generous and welcoming, receiving me, a woman scholar, accompanied by education officials from Hangzhou, as an honorary man. It also helped that beyond those very mountains lay the province of Fujian, the exact county from which my father had come, with the same kind of terrain that my hosts had known so well. Eating out in China, in short, is a huge topic that leads to many different directions. Food was about communication. It's well known, for example, that Sino-Soviet relationship went south from the very beginning during Mao's first visit to Moscow in 1849. Diplomatic historians focused on the terms of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and so forth. Ordinary Chinese people understood Mao's ire that he was served frozen fish fillet, smoked or not, and not whole fresh fish. He was also served hard liquor, which he could scarcely tolerate. Less than a decade later, Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, was in Beijing. Mao retaliated, so to speak, not only by dragging Khrushchev to the poolside, but also by serving him chili pepper, a taste for Mao, but not for everybody. Food was, of course, also about the materiality of things, about the use of lakes and mountains, and about the symbolic significance ascribed to such things. In the late 1980s, the various parts of Zhejiang remained distinct, connected by winding roads that were crowded with slow-moving cows, pushcarts, bicycles, and tricycles. A trip from Shanghai to Jiangshan, the southernmost county, took many, many days. Today, this trip of 242 miles requires less than 4 hours by cars on highways. The enhanced accessibility of the mountains means that several species of snakes, systematically captured and consumed by the millions each year since the 1960s, now face extinction. Similarly, as airlines facilitated the connections between China and the world, the Qiantang crabs, which commanded high prices in Chinese restaurants in Hong Kong, Vancouver, San Francisco, and elsewhere, faced extinction had the lake authorities not stepped in to assure their preservation. In closing, historians have documented, quote, the retreat of the elephants across continental China when human settlements advanced along with the development of agriculture. In recent decades, we see crabs, snakes, and other creatures retreating, and we also see cars, highways, and other technologies advancing. It would be fun indeed that with this talk, I might receive yet another round of university funding so as to revisit some of those thought-provoking places one more time. Thank you.
It's hard to follow in the footsteps of my colleagues, and I feel that we're moving from the sublime to the ridiculous in my talk. I'm going to share my screen with you. The ridiculous is, of course, let's see, this is not going to work maybe. That's interesting. So maybe the slideshow is not going to work. Am I able to share my screen, Maya? As not the person in charge of the presentation? I'm co-host.
Go ahead and try again.
Okay, thank you very much. Share screen. Okay. That's interesting. Okay, it's not going to work. That's fine. I'm sorry that you missed out on my slides. I guess slides as virtual background. No, that's not going to work. Okay, I'll just go straight into my talk. So I'm Rebecca McLennan. I'm an Americanist. It's nice to see some familiar names here. And thank you very much for attending. I'm going to think out loud for a moment about what it would have been like for Mao to have come here to the United States and what he might have been served. And no doubt he would have been served some form or other of a hamburger, possibly even a McDonald's hamburger, which, depending on your perspective on such things, might have made the visit with Khrushchev and the frozen fish fingers seem somewhat more appetizing. At any rate, as I've always said, every era gets the hamburger it deserves. Let me put that differently. The hamburger, its production, and various rituals around its consumption have reflected the most fundamental changes in American society, American economy, and culture. And sometimes a hamburger has enabled and become the emblem of those very changes. Now, what I thought might be quite fun to do today is to offer you a hamburger eyes view of American history, a kind of Hamburgerian history. As we'll see, the burger turns out to be both the Forrest Gump and the John D. Rockefeller of American history. The hamburger's there at all the right times, subject to very humble beginnings, but becomes fantastically upwardly mobile in the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, the hamburger's origins are much contested, but the period in which it really became a popular food among a certain section of the population was in the late Gilded Age. This hamburger came into being through, by, and for industrial capitalism. What we would recognize as a hamburger today, a ground beef patty served between two pieces of bread, probably first appeared in large numbers in the rapidly industrializing city of Chicago in the 1890s. Before then, few people besides night soilsmen, who had the odoriferous duty before the advent of flushable toilets of collecting bucket loads of household effluents off the streets in the wee hours, worked by night or at night. Soilsmen worked at night because they could see. They could see under the gaslight of street lamps. And before the 1890s, most great American factories and slaughterhouses were illuminated by the sun. Hence, what we now think of as their gorgeously big, beautiful windows and some of those sort of industrial ruins and restored buildings allowed for the kind of inflow of natural light. Sun hours more or less dictated work hours. But the Gilded Age of the late 19th century was also an electrifying age in many senses. Artificial light was installed in the great factories of the Midwest and the Northeast in the 1890s. The sun-driven rhythm of production became obsolete. And with artificial light and industrialists' pursuit of 24/7 mass production came the phenomenon of the night shift. Now, the night shift, whereby workers worked 8 to 12 hours at night in the dark, posed a problem or two. And this being America, it also posed an entrepreneurial opportunity. How could workers on the night shift grab a meal at an hour when taverns and restaurants were closed, and at a time when production was in overdrive, and most labor unions had yet to even really exist, let alone enforce workers' rights to a 1-hour meal break? Enter the mighty hamburger and its purveyors. Small armies of mobile carts equipped with a simple grill congregated around factory doors. Patties of ground beef, the cheapest of beef cuts, or really offcuts, and itself made affordable by the great disassembly lines of the Chicago slaughterhouses, were grilled in a matter of minutes and slapped between two pieces of bread. No mess, no fuss. Hungry workers devoured them on the spot, got back to work. An artifact of industrial capitalism, the hamburger itself literally helped power America's industrial revolution. The burger was a link in the industrialized energy conversion chain. The sun's energy was photosynthesized by grasses, which was then ingested and turned into muscle and fat by cattle, which were then slaughtered and transformed into beef and offcuts in the slaughterhouses of Chicago, and finally converted into delicious hamburgers, which in turn provided industrial workers the calories necessary for them to keep the factories humming through the night 24/7. Now, admittedly, I'm telling this Hamburgerian history from the patties perspective, much less the buns. I'm really not mentioning the pickles, but these histories could be interesting too, and perhaps a good senior thesis or 101 topic. So now let's fast forward to the 20th century, something that I would never really do in a class, as you may recall. I wouldn't just suddenly jump centuries, but we're having fun with this talk. Let's fast forward to the 20th century and the assembly line made famous by Henry Ford in his Michigan Ford Model T factories in the 1910s. Little known Hamburgerian fact for you. Henry Ford visited the great Chicago slaughterhouses of Swift and Armour as a young man and was greatly impressed by the hyper-efficient disassembly lines that these enterprises had innovated. The Model T assembly line that helped revolutionize automobile production from Michigan to Moscow in the early and mid-20th century was modeled on the beef disassembly line. A hamburger eye's view of history, indeed. Even more weirdly, in the mid-20th century, the company that would become most closely identified with the invention of mass-produced, cheap fast food, McDonald's, based its famous hamburger making process directly on Ford's assembly line. To be fair, other restaurant businesses such as Howard Johnson's and the first hamburger chain, White Castle, had also experimented with this Fordist system of production, but it was McDonald's that produced the Fordist burger. In the late 1940s in San Bernardino, California, Richard and Morris McDonald applied Ford's basic principles of a highly developed division of labor to increase speed, output, and uniformity of the product, and to decrease the labor costs of making a burger. After experimenting with barbecue, too slow, and hot dogs, just not that satisfying, they threw everything they had, including the kitchen sink, into burgers in 1948. By dividing the work into the discrete tasks of making the patty, grilling, toasting the bun, adding chopped onion, adding ketchup, adding 2 slices of pickles arrive. All of this was non-negotiable in the first burgers. Packing these burgers in a paper bag, someone else taking the order behind a cash register and letting the customer pick up the burger from the register, eliminating all options. This burger became the Ford Model T of dining out. It was cheap to make. Relatively unskilled workers, even teenagers, could master flipping, which would be their one task, or schmearing, again, their one task, or toasting in a matter of hours. And of course, it sold for an unbeatable 15 cents. By speeding production and redesigning subsequent hamburger stands as self-service restaurants located in newfangled areas known as the suburbs, the company helped turn the hamburger, particularly the McDonald's hamburger, from a mostly working class food to an all-American middle-class fare by the 1960s. And as historian Andrew Smith, who I think of as the world's leading hamburger historian, will tell you, 1 in 8 Americans today has worked for a McDonald's at some point in their lifetimes, which is an astounding statistic to me. Now, by this time, too, of course, no suburban backyard was complete without a grill and a dad, always the dad, who flipped burgers on the weekend. So there's also an interesting history of burgers here from the point of view of the history of gender and masculinity. These histories are more entwined than we might imagine. Finally, our hamburger's eye view of history finds our old friend, the Gump Rockefeller burger, high-lifing it at the splashy, globalized neoliberal party thrown by the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Today, hamburger consorts promiscuously with sourdough baguetry in San Francisco, shaved truffles in New York, and deceptively powerful wasabi mayo everywhere from London and Paris to New Zealand and South Africa. You might also encounter that monstrous or monstrously delicious, depending on your food politics or your ability to metabolize animal fat, foie gras topped hamburger. Does that pose an omnivore's dilemma? Then there's also the tri-beef burger, which combines Argentine beef, Japanese Wagyu beef, and American prime beef, and costs a mere $125 plus the airfare to Boca Raton, Florida. If all of the above appeal to you and to your sense of taste, you could always grab the super efficient $160 X burger, which packs Australian Wagyu beef, foie gras, black truffles into a single exquisite brioche bun. Either way, you can do something that you couldn't have done even just 30 years ago. Spend a fortune on a gussied up version of the humble hot sandwich that once powered the American industrial night shift. And that's just one way of giving you a hamburger eyes view of history. Hungry, anyone?
Thank you so much to our panelists. You see some of the brilliance of the Berkeley History Department on there, and you also see some of the like pointed questions that they're trying to get you to think about. So the floor is open in the Q&A. We'd ask you to use the Q&A if possible for questions. And I'm going to begin with a few questions for individual panelists that have come in advance. So we appreciate all of the questions that we got in advance. I'm going to start by feeding one of them to James Vernon, because we've already had a little bit of Q&A back and forth about pubs. And we've got the question about how the pub experience in Britain has changed in the last 100 years. So if there were pubs 100 years ago, and forgive me as a historian of science, that's not my expertise to judge, have they been serving the same foodstuffs and beverages to the same social classes and socioeconomic groups? How have pubs changed?
I love this question. My grandfather was a publican, and it was some of the happiest times of my childhood was going to visit him and being behind the bar and helping changing the barrels of beer. I'm deeply attached to pubs, and those of you, and I can see some people out there, know that I have a very unsecret habit of stopping off at the pub on Solano on my way back from work almost every day, although I've now had to stop smoking, sadly. But you asked not about me, but about pubs, and the reality is that there's so many different types of pubs. It's a, you know, I'm going to do the classic historians thing to say it's really a very complex question. So there were the types of pubs that we would call inns, that were always served food, and those inns would be invariably, you know, the place where stagecoaches would meet, and people would stop off and stay the night. But I suspect that you're really talking about the types of pubs like that my grandfather had, and food was really not, and was just really not present in pubs really at all. There would be food carts that would be selling foods outside pubs in the 19th and early 20th century. The big innovation was, of course, the introduction of what in England is called a crisp in a packet. There's a word for it here, and I've done this thing of like translating British to American all the time. I'm forgetting what they're called here, but a kettle chip. Is it a chip? Yeah, it's a chip. So those began to be sold along with peanuts and stuff like that behind bars in the 1920s and the 1930s. But the introduction of what became known as pub grub was really something that didn't happen until the deep fat fryers became cheap and popular in the 1960s. It became especially more common in the 1970s with the invention of the microwave. So we're talking about pub foods that you don't want to eat. It was really the 1980s that foods moved into pubs big time. And that's because in 1988, as part of the many forms of deregulation that were going on in Britain at that point, licensing laws were relaxed and pubs could stay open for 12 hours. And so therefore, pub owners had to basically diversify, because even Britons can't drink for 12 hours straight. They have to have some food to help that stuff go down. The sense of those of you who visited the UK recently will know there's a whole new phenomena of the gastropub, which is basically a fancy restaurant in something that pretends to be a pub. It's not really a pub, it's more of a restaurant, you know, in a thematized pub. And the interesting thing about those gastropubs is that they're trying to reinvent British cuisine. You know, they're trying to reinvent the foods that became unpalatable and made Britain famous for having awful food, and showing that actually they can be cooked reasonably well and you could enjoy a bite to eat in the pub. So this is a really, like the development of the restaurant trade and the scale it is now, it's a very, very recent development.
That is brilliant. Thank you so much, James, for that reflection. I should say Professor Vernon, forgive me. And now I have a question that comes in for Professor Yeh. And it's a question, I think, underneath deeply about food and national transformations. At some points in your talk, including your closing, you alluded to transportation and connections between regions in China. And so the question from the audience is, has the economic prosperity and connectivity between different Chinese regions led to a more nationally unified cuisine, or is something else going on? As they say pretty poetically, as they ask, how has Chinese cuisine changed along with the highways that now traverse the previously difficult to reach regions you describe? Is that a big enough question, Professor Yeh?
Right. Hold on one second. If I unmuted myself. That's a terrific question, and I suppose it can be taken up in a couple of scenarios. That is scenario number one. In late imperial China, for instance, even before all of these things about transportation, mobility, connections were happening, in major cities such as Beijing or in Hangzhou, merchant guilds coming from all of the country, traveling across long distance, they they present their hometown cuisine. At the same time, they also take ideas from each other. So in that sense, that's the development of a food metropole, so to speak, is not something that's happening only today. Scenario number two, when it comes to different regional cuisines coming into interaction with each other, exile or diaspora actually very often facilitates that kind of connection, right? If we take Taiwan or Hong Kong or Vancouver, not to mention San Francisco, as places, for example, these are places where there is no such thing as an authentic, even though they all market themselves as such, there is no authentic, say, Shanghai cuisine. And even in Shanghai itself, the whole notion of what authenticity constitutes no longer stays stable. So in that sense, the emergence of a nationalized or ethnicized Chinese cuisine, it's more a product of the context and less simply a matter of transportation or mobility. And then the third scenario, which is of today, my suspicion is China today, with the opening up all of these roads into the mountains and so on and so forth, coming along with it is also a sense of the diversity and the multiplicity of this country and this culture, and the usefulness or the desirability to preserve that diversity. Of course, all of that within the framing of something broadly referred to as China in Chinese. So what is my answer to this big question? It's yes and no, and maybe so, depends. This is a classic response that we offer. Thank you.
We are historians, so the sort of brilliant diversity of insights that we pack together into one answer is part of our job. So a question for Professor McLennan. I'm going to key off something that's actually in the Q&A. there's a sort of factual question about hamburgers originating as pounded beef in Hamburg. How did it change, if it did in fact transit from Germany? And I think the larger question that might be tied to is, how do dishes get marked as quintessentially American food? Because if you consider other dishes that are sometimes thought of as being of foreign origin, such as pizza or bagels, they get translated into an American idiom and made quintessentially American. Is there a recipe to make a quintessentially American food in this world of connections and global links?
Well, I think there are many different types of quintessentially American food. And it's a great question. Thank you, whoever posed it. And thank you for elaborating on it, Catherine. I think that in the case of the hamburger, it becomes quintessentially American at the point at which its production is scaled up. It's actually on the, there's a version of hamburger. Yes, so chopped beef is something that is familiar to people who live in Hamburg, and with the influx of German immigrants into the United States in the 19th century, you start to see chopped beef, not necessarily ground, but chopped beef turning up, chopped beef patties. For example, Delmonico's 1834, the most famous sort of high-end New York restaurant, has an kind of a Hamburg meat, rather not necessarily hamburger, but a Hamburg meat chopped beef dish on its menu. It crops up again in some, strangely enough, medical treatises on why raw chopped beef in the Hamburg style is actually very good for your digestion. But it's not really until the 1890s that it starts to be sort of consumed on any and produced on any kind of scale. And even then, its introduction sort of beyond Chicago and other sort of industrial centers is at the 1904 St. Louis Fair, an exposition, and it receives quite a warm reception. They sell out. But it's still considered a working class food until White Castle, the first hamburger chain, actually one of the first kind of restaurant chains of any kind of cuisine, comes along in 1924, 1925, and starts trying to chip away at this kind of somewhat seamy reputation that the hamburger has as a working class and sort of quite sort of low quality food. And of course, a couple of years after the St. Louis exposition, there of course is the publication of The Jungle, and the kind of scandal around minced and ground meats of various kinds. Mostly people think about that going into the sausage meat, but it's the same problem, and hamburgers are tarred with the same brush. And it's still considered it's the cheapest cut of meat and the meat of workers. So it really takes the kind of entrepreneurial work of the White Castle owners to turn it into something that is more acceptable. And then McDonald's finishes off that work that White Castle had started in the 1940s. It's really not a middle class American food until the 1950s. It's not really considered an appropriate food if you're middle class or elite. So it has this fascinating class history to it. And I really, that's why I said it's sort of like the John D. Rockefeller of foods, because it starts off with very, very sort of humble origins in the United States, at least, and then it sort of scales up, and it kind of develops a monopoly, as John D. Rockefeller did, over the notion of what a kind of quintessential American food is. And then it ends up in our own sort of very neoliberal time. You can there's a restaurant in Amsterdam that charges over $5,000 for a single hamburger that it contains. It's kind of like an emblem to globalization gone awry. It has beluga caviar in it. It has Dom Perignon, soaked Japanese tiger tomatoes sliced onto it. There's gold dust on the bun, so that after the consumer has finished eating this monstrosity, they have gold fingers. And it costs over $5,000. So this is, in a sense, you can see how the hamburger has traveled with the history of capitalism in some very interesting ways, at any rate. And let's not even get onto lab-grown meat, which is also kind of fascinating. I think that's the next chapter in the hamburger's history, as a biotech chapter. So.
Bringing us up very much to the present, I think. That provokes a question that can go to, I think, all of the panelists at once. We've seen a COVID era shift to takeout and outdoor dining. Based on the long histories and the structured reflections that you've given us, what do you think future historians will say is happening right now in the context of the pandemic?
James, why did you go first in the order?
I knew someone would volunteer my big mouth for this one.
Volunteering you.
Thanks, Wen-hsin. Love you back. It's such a difficult question. I mean, I think at one level, I'd like to say that, and I'm touching wood and everything, crossing everything that I can, that, the pandemic may be such a, short period of time in terms of the types of, rhythms of the historical timeframes that we've been talking about, that it may not really register much at all. That would be one possibility. It seems to me that there are two things that come out of the pandemic experience that I hope don't change, but this is just my own personal, my own personal hopes of what comes out of this. And the first is that the ways in which restaurants have been able to reclaim streets a little bit and pavements and to create more of a public space outside. I think it's going to be hard to wind that back in, and there's already some evidence in some cities around the world that that's unlikely to happen, and it may actually become part of the ways of trying to manage traffic flow in new ways. So that seems to me to be really exciting. The other thing that I hope doesn't change is that I think the pandemic has given us a greater consciousness about the labor practices of the service industries. And we've seen that in terms of unionization campaigns. Amazon would be a great example of that, even at universities as well. And I think there are signs that labor organizers are very hopeful of being able to get food service workers involved in those campaigns too. So I very much hope that's the case. I doubt that one's going to happen because that's a very transient workforce, but I have my fingers crossed.
Okay, so I'll try next. I mean, the pandemic in China is experienced in ways which are very different from elsewhere. And so that's one of the starting points for us to consider the longer term ramifications. And I think that on the whole, the longer term effects are going to be more acutely observed or experienced in urban settings. And by urban setting in China, a small city, a virtually negligible size, small city, very often it's a city of about 1 million people. And then the country in recent decades is undergoing rapid urbanization. to the point that those places that I visited 30 years ago as counties, those counties as administrative units are literally disappearing, and they are all urbanizing. So within this broader context of massive urbanization and then also concentration of population, my sense is that there are a couple of indicators that would be interesting for us to observe. First, something like Meituan, for instance, as an enterprise, which is functionally the equivalent of DoorDasher or Caviar. But then at the same time, it combines other features such as Yelp, whatever, and what you call it, TripAdvisor, multiple sorts of functions. Those things are taking off in a major way. And these are corporate entities achieving size, which are multiple times that of DoorDasher or Carvia, precisely because of the concentration of urban population, the density of urban population. And the second thing that's likely going to happen is probably for takeouts to become a normalized form of food business. So in other words, what this is going to mean is the further stratification of commercial dining. That is, it's going to become top of this top of the line, that a restaurant actually offers seating and hosting people and investing in the decor for the ambiance and the service and so on and so forth. Those are going to continue to, those are definitely going to thrive. It's simply that the charge is going to be, or the price gap between something like that and the usual sorts of street corner ordinary restaurants, that gap is going to enormously increase. So people are going to have a choice. Do you really want to have a restaurant experience? Well, if you do, it's no longer going to be quite so casual. If you want it casual, there will be plenty of places and lots of people ready to offer the delivery. So that's my hunch about how things are going to go in the Chinese case, especially that, I mean, cities are in lockdown, and it's not just going to be about restaurants, it's also about grocery stores. It's the supply of the entire chain of food.
Fascinating. Professor McLennan, would you like to weigh in?
I don't have that much to add. I do find everything James and Wen-hsin have said really interesting. I think what sort of stood out for me during the pandemic was the kind of revival of home cooking, and in particular what people were cooking, and this kind of crazy sort of mass embrace of making sourdough bread, which kind of was something that was revived here in San Francisco in the Bay Area in the 1970s and 80s by the founders of Acme Bread. And so I often think about that. What is it that, you know, not only that people started cooking at home a lot, but also, you know, what kinds of things they were cooking. Bread is kind of, you know, has this long religious and cultural significance as the staff of life, which so just struck me of all the things that you might want to, and I'm not one of the people who started baking bread. I'm sort of a late adopter. I'm actually thinking of, we just got a bread maker about a week ago, like 3 years too late. Yeah, no, it's, and I guess I'm not sure, I'm very hesitant as a historian to speculate too much on what will be a lasting and what will not be a lasting shift. I think that weaknesses in our food system, including the labor issues that James pointed to, were pre-existing weaknesses were laid bare, and they were always there. And so I think that something might come out of that, but it's very hard to know whether this whole period will just be thought of as a blip, as the late 1920s or even the mid 1920s thought of the Spanish flu years as a blip, or kind of forgot about it, got written out of history. So it's hard for us to imagine that, but in 5 or 8 years' time, I'm just not sure how historians will narrate this period. I'm not sure it will get 6 or 8 pages as it did in my latest version of Becoming America. It might get 2 pages, it might get 20 pages. It's just really unclear.
That's a really important perspective for all of us to hold on to as we live in this moment of change. What we make of it will depend also on what comes next, and that story is yet to be written. So there are some really fascinating questions in the chat that we won't have a chance to get to because our time is short. Questions about intercultural borrowings and adoption and rephrasings of what a national cuisine is, questions about the ways in which food can divide us, not just bring us together. I regret that we can't continue the conversation forever. And I think at this point, well, before I close, I want to share, as we wrap up, a quick flash of admiration for one very special person who is on this call today, Leah Flanagan, the History Department's undergraduate major advisor. She will be retiring at the end of the spring semester. I believe she is still here on the Zoom. And I wanted to acknowledge her presence and invite any of you to drop any quick notes or memories into the Zoom. Many of you will have sought, if you were undergraduates in this department, sought her counsel, or in other ways gotten the benefit of her warmth and wisdom. We will miss her. And although I expect that as an alum of the department, she'll be back for the next History Homecoming, this is a moment of transition that we want to acknowledge. We wish you a wonderful retirement, Leah, and just know we're not letting go of you. So yes, I'm seeing lots of wonderful notes in the chat. So as we close, I'll say our next event in this larger series of happenings under the masterful support of Maya Cisneros and our co-leads Sandra Ader and Dilyana Angelova will be on March 16th. So please look out for it. The History Colloquium will be featuring our colleague Susanna Elm, once again made accessible by Zoom. So March 16th, Professor Susanna Elm. And finally, warm thanks to our panelists, James Vernon, Wen-hsin Yeh, and Rebecca McLennan, and to all of you who've attended. We so value these opportunities to come together with you. Please stay in touch and join us again. With that, I bid you a happy evening. Stay in touch with the History Department and come back and visit us in Dwinell Hall someday soon. Thank you all. Good night.